I was away last weekend. My daughter Allison, our firstborn, was married on Saturday. And I had the privilege of both walking her down the grassy aisle, that was the setting of her wedding in their backyard, and then to turn around and preside at the wedding. It was an amazing event, wonderful. It touched me in so many ways. Some of those kind of caught me by surprise. One of them was when she took my arm and we began that walk down the aisle together. And I leaned over and said to her, I remember feeling like this when I held you in my arms in the delivery room. The other one that caught me by surprise was at the rehearsal the night before. We were going through the service, and it came time to the giving and exchanging of rings. And my new soon-to-be son-in-law, Brad, took the ring that he was giving to Allison and placed it on her finger. And I said, part way as you offer your vow to her. And then, after completing the vow, you put the ring on the rest of the way. And I said, as I've said to every couple that I've done these rehearsals with, now, it might not slide on easily. So don't force it. Don't hurt her. And much to my surprise, I said, now don't you ever hurt her. Such is a relationship between a father and a daughter. Now I set that up before we plunge into that incredibly challenging first reading from Genesis. That story we heard, undoubtedly wondered and maybe even shuddered at. That we would hear that in church, God asking Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac, his beloved son Isaac. And we wonder, why? And we are struggling with, why do we hear this terrible story that it's hard to connect to? Well, the church and our Jewish forebears continue to listen to ponder, to struggle with, to learn from that story when God tested Abraham. The story begins by setting it up. After these things, God tested Abraham. Now we know what some of these things are. We've been hearing of them over the last several weeks, but let me go over a few of them. God's call to Abraham, pretty much out of the blue, a call that was demanding, go to a land that he had never seen, to leave his family and much of his wealth behind. We heard of God's promise to Abraham that he would be the father of a great nation. We heard of the long years of Sarah's barrenness and undoubtedly leading to questions of, how am I to be a father of many nations when I don't even have an offspring? And we hear of Sarah and Abraham taking it into their own hands and arranging for Abraham to father a child through Hagar, and the birth of that child, Ishmael. And a few weeks ago, we heard of the visit that Abraham had from 3 strangers who promised that he, through Sarah, would have a son. And how Sarah laughed. But when that son was born, Isaac, a boy whose name speaks of laughter. So that is some of all of these things. This faithful journey of Abraham, this ongoing covenant relationship between Abraham and God. And it has come to a point where God puts Abraham to the test. Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I will show you. I mentioned how the Jews reflect on this passage. In fact, it is a passage read on the holy day of Rosh Hashanah. One rabbi said, when God asked Abraham to bring his son Isaac as a sacrifice, the test was not whether Abraham would do what he was asked. Of course Abraham would. Throughout the ages, many run-of-the-mill Jews would willingly give up their lives for the sanctification of God's name. And this was Abraham, the obedient one. And he had received a direct order from God, this rabbi says. But he goes on. The test actually was, how would Abraham respond to the test? And when Abraham got up early in the morning with energy and joy to do the will of God, that's when he passed the test with flying colors. He got up early in the morning with energy and joy to do the will of God. Well, I puzzled over that. I didn't see that in the text. But in the rabbinic school, oftentimes they will elaborate to invite us to search the passage more fully. What if that is true? What would we learn in that instance? In essence, the rabbi is inviting his listeners, and I invite us to ask that question, not just of obedience, because people will be obedient under threat, when fearful. But I think God was asking something else of Abraham. When you are a beloved child of God, when you know in your heart that God holds a great promise for you, then how will you respond in times of testing? And the writer of this passage seems to offer a reason to think that there was much time in between that leaving and finally arriving at that moment when Abraham was ready to plunge the knife into his son. Much time for Abraham to be considering God's request. What went through his mind as he walked with Isaac, his son? As his son asks, "Where's the lamb?" And he replies, "God will provide." What was going through Abraham's mind when he laid the wood for the sacrificial fire on his strapping young son's back because the donkey could not make the trek up the last part of the mountain? And he saw his son look on him trustingly. Abraham continued until that last moment when God cries out, "Stop." Abraham had shown the depth and how solid his trusting relationship with God was. We hold Abraham as an example of faith, that he would do what God asked. He passed the test. And it offers us the challenge to ask ourselves, how do we respond to the tests that come our way? One Jewish rabbi, speaking to her congregation, said one of the important things is to recognize that tests come from God. Because if a test comes from God, it's not a random, meaningless situation. If a test comes from God, it is given to us with a purpose for us to grow, for our growth as persons, as followers of Jesus, as a parent or a child or a spouse or a friend. We are tested that we might grow in our faith, in our love. And the rabbi went on and said, now you must understand that we must summon the positive energy to deal with the situation. And summoning that energy is a part of the test itself. Do we cry out in prayer, in faith? Do we know that by God's grace, we will have the means and abilities to pass whatever test God might set before us, to face it head on with energy and a positive attitude, resting assured that God's love is greater than any test that comes our way? I'm not sure I know the answer to that question for myself. As an on-call chaplain, as a parish priest, I have seen so many people face such difficult tests. A mother of a 5-year-old in hospital on a rainy night because the taxi driver didn't realize that her 5-year-old daughter had stepped out of the car as he was backing up. I could tell you other stories of parents with infants and adult children in desperate situations. I don't know how I would reply. It's a hard lesson, a hard test to figure this out, to sort it out. We get a little example of how do we respond, how does God respond in these situations in today's gospel passage. It's the closing lines of when Jesus is telling his disciples to go out on a missionary journey. And he has told them before we get to this part that there would be sacrifices that they would be making, that they would be persecuted, that this would not be an easy thing. But today, he gives them a little glimpse of how God will carry them through the tests that lie before them. Someone will offer you hospitality. When you're parched, someone will offer you a cool drink. Jesus invites them and us to look for those little signs and recognize that the hand of God's providence is being worked out through those people. In Paul's letter to the Romans, this man who had once persecuted the followers of Jesus had such a profound encounter with the risen Christ that he completely abandoned the security that he knew with his fellow scribes and Pharisees, with his adherence to the law. And he followed God's call to be a missionary across the known world that he could reach out to people that he would have otherwise previously scorned. And Paul knew the persecutions that came as a result of that. But he persisted, and he encourages the Romans to persist as he knows this newfound freedom of acting out of the pure love that God has poured into him. I don't know if I could do what Paul did, to face the persecution that he faced and come through it as a loving person. Not knowing is a part of what motivates my going on a sabbatical in a month and a half. We are blessed by examples of Abraham, of Jesus, of Paul, and of countless saints and people who have affected our lives over the years. The sabbatical, I begin retracing some of my own faith journey, going back to Wisconsin, to the parish where I discovered my faith, going to the high school where I was nurtured in my faith. And then I am going to Europe, to Italy, to Assisi, where Francis and Claire entered into a journey of faith, where in fact they took upon themselves a test of putting all their trust in God through a perpetual vow of poverty. They gave up lives as a part of a merchant class, in Francis's case, as the daughter of a noble, Claire's case, gave it all up out of love for God, and through that love, they served the poor. Francis, one of the big changes in his life came when he was compelled by God to go forth and to kiss a leper, a person who had previously been repulsive to this saint. And he kissed him and knew that he had kissed the face of Christ in doing so. I go to Assisi seeking inspiration, seeking to learn from their example of being in that holy place. And then we will also go to Avila in Spain, the home of John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila, 14th century Spanish mystics. And I go to them seeking inspiration and to learn. They were brilliant with respect to the spiritual journey, what is going on within each and every soul that is trying to live out this life of faith. John had to search his soul and to hold on tight to his faith, while his fellow Carmelites imprisoned him for 6 months because he was encouraging them to reform, to change, to become more Christ-like, to trust more in God and less in wealth. So John is a brilliant teacher about those dark times when we don't feel the hand of God. And John offers the good news that God is still holding you in those times of testing, that God is inviting you to rely on that great gift of God, that great gift that for many of us is often filled with doubts and questions and uncertainties, and yet, we keep coming back. And John invites us to continue that journey. And so I will go for 2 months. It's hard to leave a congregation for 2 months when you care so much for their welfare, for their growth. But I go that I might grow, so that I might be a better guide for all of us. Learning how, from Francis and Claire, to serve the poor, to take the risks. Learning how to guide through the challenges and the questions that are deep in our hearts. Learning how to be more Christ-like. We don't like to be tested, for fear that it might reveal our weaknesses, our frailties, our sin. But the lesson of today's readings is that tests are a means of God's grace, a means by which our relationship, our trust in God's providential care might grow. An invitation to take hard steps in faith, in hope, and in love. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost.